Welcome back. We are building on our knowledge base about the complex experiences of Indigenous people in the Americas by looking at Chicano histories and Chicano experiences. We're thinking about their experiences by considering the connection to Mexican people, by considering the colonization of the west of what we now call the United States. We can have a more nuanced and critical understanding of belonging. Who gets to belong? What histories have to be erased? What narratives have to be created in order to construct the condition of immigrant? When we watched the Native American docuseries, we focused on indigenous nations before colonization. That was during week 8. If you remember in episode 4, we were introduced to colonialism through the invasion of Spain. So we'll talk a little bit about that. You recall the phrase age of discovery as the first iteration of colonialism from our reading during weeks 6 or 7. It's also referred to as the age of exploration, or the period between the 15th century as Spain begins funding voyages in early 1400 until the late 18th century, when Spanish conquest was at its height around 1790. So consider that the movement of the Spanish conquistadors across the Americas is also a movement into and on top of indigenous people, the indigenous nations that we learned about in week 8 during those 4 videos. I want you to think about, how is it that those indigenous people who were occupying what is now California and Washington and Oregon, people who occupied those lands already are forced further south, and they become known as immigrants or foreigners in this country? So I want you to consider those questions as we talk more in this video. So like we learned in the week 8 videos, the New World isn't new at all. By the time Columbus arrives in 1942 in the Caribbean, these lands were home to 100 million people. Their ancestral roots had stretched back more than 13,000 years. They had lived in hundreds of nations across the 2 continents. They were linked by social and cultural networks. We saw that they had invented unique systems of science, art, writing, that they had full civilizations, full religious practices. They were in community with one another. They traveled across thousands of miles to be in community with one another. It was a vast network. They had built some of the world's largest cities. They had created governments from empires to America's first democracy. This means that Columbus and other colonizers were destroying full systems, full societies, full civilizations, full governing structures, full traditions and belief systems, full ways of being and walks of life. They were destroying systems of value. They were destroying knowledge that already existed in favor of the narrative that indigenous people were nothing and had nothing to offer. But I pose this question to you. If you were to conquer something or someone, do you go after the nothingness? Do you go after the place that's lacking anything of value? Or do you pursue something that is full and rich and diverse already, something that you can gain from? It's important to think about, because our social beliefs today are grounded in the stories that they tell about conquered people not having anything, not knowing anything. And a lot of our value, remember the term axiology, a lot of the value that we place on different groups of people's lives have to do with these narratives that construct them as lacking already, as less than human. So this is important for us to consider. So this map here, and I'm showing you a series of a couple of maps. This one, again, if you remember, is the pre-colonial Native American maps. It shows a lot of the indigenous nations that existed before the colonizer. So this is showing North America, Central America, and South America. This map shows the route that Christopher Columbus took in all of his voyages. And remember, Christopher Columbus in this initial voyage was looking for India and was lost. So he found these areas by accident. This is the Mexica Aztec Empire in 1519. And this part of the history of what occurs to indigenous people is very important. A Spanish conquistador named Cortez, who conquered the Aztec Empire, paved the way for the rise of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, and I'll talk a little more about that in just a minute. The conquistadors were the earliest Spanish explorers in the Americas, but they were motivated mostly by greed and glory, seeking to dominate indigenous people, seeking to commandeer and steal gold and silver and other resources. They found quite an abundance of resources in this area. So this becomes a space and place where they focus a lot of their murderous intention on. The term Mexico is derived from an Aztec term. While under colonial rule by Spanish, this area is called New Spain. Spain has control over the region from 1519 to 1821, so over a couple of centuries. Cortez founded Veracruz. In 1521, he and his soldiers captured Teotihuacan, which is this area here. And this becomes a very, very important location of capture and conquest for the Spanish. So this is just a map of the Spanish Empire by 1790, which is the height of their empire. This is, the red is what Spain had captured. And then this, I wanted you to see this one so that you can look at the fullness that was Mexico early on, right? Okay, so during Spanish Empire, all of this is Upper California. Over here is Texas. When we go down into Central America, and then South America is further down. So we have 1492 when Christopher Columbus makes his first voyage to the Americas and lands in the Caribbean, right? Then in 1519, Cortez set sail from Cuba to explore and conquer Mexico. From 1519 to 1521, Cortez and his forces conquered the Aztec Empire, which I show you here. So that would be this area in here. Over the next few decades, the Spanish are exploring along the western coast, along the southern border, and into Florida. By the late 16th century, Spanish colonization efforts expanded into present-day New Mexico, Arizona, and California. By 1680, the Pueblo Revolt in present-day New Mexico temporarily drives out Spanish settlers. During the period of time in the state of California, or in what will become the state of California, there are different status of people. There are indigenous people, there are Californios. Those are people who are more of elite status. They are of lighter skin, usually of Spanish descent, who hold positions of power. There are a number of missions that are doing religious work, which is also in an effort to colonize on the coast. And so they are creating quite a bit of a caste system, that there is the elite Spanish settler and their descendants, and then there are people who are indigenous who also exist. Now, these folks are being colonized, and as you saw, in much of the material that we've had over the last couple of weeks. Colonization included conversion for religion. It included a removal of traditional belief systems. It included the erasure of language. It often included changing names and that kind of thing. So in the late 18th century, Spanish colonial rule in North America comes to an end with the Mexican War of Independence that went on from 1810 to 1821, in addition to the independence movements in Central America. The Mexican War of Independence was against Spain. It was an armed conflict and political process resulting in Mexico's independence from the Spanish Empire. It was not a singular, coherent event, but there were local struggles, there were regional struggles that occurred within the same period of time, again, from 1810 to 1821. And it can be considered a revolutionary war, right? So the area that we know as Texas is incorporated into the Mexican Empire in 1821 and is declared a republic in 1836 when Texas declares its independence from Mexico. Then we come up to the Mexican-American War and the American Conquest. This is from the mid to 19th century. Following the Mexican-American War, this is from 1846 to 1848, we get the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It was signed in 1848. It officially ends the war and cedes California to the United States. California's population surges. There's a lot more settlement happening. There is a lot of movement of European settlers who are interested in the gold rush, who are crossing the country and settling into California. This is also a period of time of of many massacres of indigenous people. They were killed off by the hundreds of thousands during this period of time. This is also a period of time when Californios who had once been considered someone of power and elite status loses their status in this in the West Coast, and they have to rely on so then how do we connect this to our understanding of belonging? What we're looking at is what is the United States as it was divided before conquest. There were people here. So what I want you to understand, I think what I'm trying to get you to fully realize is that as the US expands west, it is pushing indigenous people west to the west and to the south. And it is creating at the southern borders, and borders are arbitrary kind of boundaries, right? They're not inherently etched out in the land. These are boundaries that people have agreed upon. Some people haven't agreed upon, are made or forced upon them. So when we're thinking about belonging and we're thinking about the indigenous people who are pushed out, I want you to consider the question of how the US had effectively made a quote unquote foreigner or an alien out of the very people to whom the land belonged to in the first place. How do we begin to equate the word immigrant with brown people at our southern borders? This is not arbitrary. And so the fight for recognition for Chicano people in the West is not just a fight about seeing them. It's not a fight about acknowledgement. It is a fight about creating a belonging that is responding to the condition of immigrant that has been forced upon a group of people for whom this land belonged to in the first place, right? It is considering their fight is like other indigenous people, is about land. It's about a recognition or an ability to have their language, to have their cultural traditions, to have their belief systems, and to still be treated equally and with equity in this country, right? So I want you to consider that. I want you to think about belonging as you move through these materials for this week.